The year was 1749. South Carolina was quiet on the surface, but under that silence was fear, anger, and pain. On a large rice plantation near the banks of the Santee River lived a young enslaved man called Mingo. That was not the name his mother gave him in Africa. That name had been taken from the moment chains closed around his wrists years earlier. But on that plantation, that was the only name he was allowed to answer to. Mingo was tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. He worked from sunrise to sunset in the muddy rice fields, his feet always wet, his back always bent. The plantation belonged to a wealthy slave master named Edward Whitcomb. Edward Whitcomb was known in the county as a strict man. But strict was not the right word. Cruel was the right word. He believed fear was the only way to control human beings. And his two sons, Thomas and Henry Whitcomb, followed their father's footsteps with pride. Thomas was 18 years old in 1749. Henry was 16. Both had been raised to see the enslaved as property, not people. Both carried whips the way other young men carried books. Both believed that pain was power. Mingo's mother, Abina, worked in the main house as a cook. She had once been strong and joyful, but years of loss had carved deep lines into her face. She had lost a husband during the Middle Passage. She had lost 2 children to sickness in the rice swamps. Mingo was her last surviving child. Every night after the work bell ended the day, she would whisper stories to him about the land they came from. She told him about rivers wider than imagination, about drums that echoed into the stars, about warriors who fought with honor. She told him never to forget who he was. But on a hot afternoon in the summer of 1749, something happened that would burn those stories into a different kind of fire. The sun was cruel that day. The air was thick and heavy. Thomas and Henry rode their horses into the field to inspect the workers. One elderly enslaved woman stumbled from exhaustion. Her name was Abina, Mingo's mother. She fell face down in the mud. Thomas laughed. Henry shouted that she was pretending. They ordered her to stand. She tried. Her body shook. She fell again. Thomas dismounted his horse. He lifted his whip. Henry did the same. What happened next stayed in Mingo's mind like a wound that never closed. The 2 young men whipped Abina again and again while the overseer watched without speaking. The other enslaved workers were forced to watch. Mingo was held by 2 men, so he would not move. He screamed for them to stop. He begged. He promised to work double. But Thomas only laughed louder. Henry counted each strike like a game. When they were done, Abina did not move. She lay still in the mud. Mingo broke free and ran to her. Her back was torn open. Her breathing was shallow. She looked at him one last time. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. By sunset, she was dead. The plantation returned to silence as if nothing had happened. Edward Whitcomb called it discipline. The overseer called it necessary. But inside Mingo, something changed. That night, he did not cry. He did not shout. He did not speak. He sat beside the small burial ground behind the slave quarters and stared into the darkness. The drums his mother once described seemed to beat inside his chest. Slow, heavy, waiting. The next morning, he returned to the rice fields as usual. He bent his back as usual. He answered when called as usual, but his eyes were no longer the same. In 1749, enslaved people were watched closely. After the Stoner Rebellion years earlier, white fear had grown stronger. Patrols roamed the roads. Punishments became harsher. Any sign of rebellion was crushed quickly. Mingo understood this. He knew rage without patience was death, so he chose silence. He chose observation. He began to study Thomas and Henry. He learned their habits. Thomas liked to drink rum late into the night. Henry often walked alone to the stables after dark. They believed no enslaved person would dare touch them. They believed fear had erased courage. But fear does not erase memory. It sharpens it. Mingo spoke little, but he listened to everything. He listened to the overseer complain about broken tools. He listened to field hands whisper about runaway maroons in the swamps. He listened to house servants share rumors about tensions between Edward Whitcomb and neighboring planters. Information was power, and Mingo gathered it slowly. One evening, An older enslaved man named Kofi approached him quietly. Kofi had seen many seasons. He had scars across his back, like a map of suffering. He warned Mingo not to let anger control him. He said revenge brought more death. Mingo listened respectfully, but inside, the image of his mother's last breath replayed again and again. This was not anger without reason. This was not wild fury. This was justice in a world where justice did not exist for people like him. Weeks passed. The plantation moved through routine. Rice harvest approached. Thomas and Henry grew careless. They believed the enslaved were broken. They believed the memory of that summer day had faded. But memory does not fade when it is carved with blood. Mingo began preparing in small ways. He volunteered for tasks near the blacksmith shed so he could study tools. He memorized which doors creaked and which did not. He learned which guards drank heavily and which stayed alert. Every movement was careful, every step calculated. He waited for the right moment, the right night, because revenge is not a scream. Revenge is a whisper that waits for silence. And as autumn approached in 1749, that silence was coming. Thomas Wickham had begun planning a celebration for his upcoming 19th birthday. There would be music. There would be guests from nearby plantations. There would be rum and laughter and arrogance. And in the shadows of that coming celebration, Mingo saw opportunity. He did not yet know how it would end. He did not yet know what it would cost. But he knew one thing with certainty. The sons who had whipped his mother to death would not grow old in peace. The rice fields still shimmered under the southern sun. The plantation still looked calm from a distance. But beneath the calm, a storm was forming, and its name was Mingo. The days moved slowly toward Thomas Whitcomb's birthday celebration, and the plantation prepared as if nothing dark had ever happened on its soil. Lanterns were cleaned. Barrels of rum were rolled into the storage shed near the main house. Fresh meat was ordered from nearby farms. White guests from neighboring plantations confirmed they would attend. Music was arranged. Fiddlers were hired. It was to be a night of laughter, pride, and careless joy. But while the Wickham family prepared for celebration, Mingo prepared for something else entirely. He continued his routine without change. He woke before dawn. He worked in the rice fields with steady hands. He spoke only when spoken to. The overseer even remarked that Mingo had become obedient since his mother's death. That comment made Thomas laugh. Henry said grief had broken him. They did not understand that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is planning. Mingo had begun spending more time near the tool shed. The plantation blacksmith was an older enslaved man named Jacob. Jacob had once tried to run years ago and lost 3 fingers as punishment. Since then, he kept his head low and his eyes down. But Jacob still noticed things. One afternoon, as he hammered iron into shape, he saw Mingo watching closely. Mingo did not ask questions at first. He simply observed. The heat from the forge glowed against his skin. The sound of metal striking metal rang sharp in the air. After some time, Mingo quietly offered to pump the bellows. Jacob allowed it. That was the first step. Over the next few weeks, Mingo volunteered often. He learned how iron could be shaped. He learned how blades were sharpened. He learned how long it took for a piece of metal to cool. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of curiosity. But inside him, every spark from that forge felt like a promise. At night, when the plantation slept, Mingo would lie awake listening. He counted footsteps. He counted guard patrol times. Since the Stono Rebellion in 1739, fear had ruled white households in South Carolina. Patrols moved along roads. Guns were kept loaded. But familiarity breeds carelessness. The Wickham plantation had not seen rebellion in years. Slowly, the guards relaxed. Thomas Wickham began drinking heavily most nights. Rum loosened his discipline. He would stagger from the main house to the stables alone, singing loudly. Henry often followed later, less drunk but equally arrogant. They believed terror protected them. They believed the enslaved would never strike back. Mingo also began visiting the burial ground more often. He sat beside the simple marker that covered his mother's grave. There was no proper headstone, no name carved in stone, just earth. He would sit and whisper softly. He would remember her stories. He would remember her warning to never forget who he was. And in those quiet moments, his resolve became solid. He was not acting out of sudden rage. He was acting out of memory. The night before the celebration arrived, lanterns were hung from tree branches. Long tables were arranged outside the main house. Slaves were ordered to cook through the night. Abundant food filled the air with rich smells. Guests began arriving by carriage in the late afternoon. Laughter echoed across the yard. Mingo worked quietly in the background, carrying crates, stacking firewood, doing whatever was asked. He moved unnoticed. Invisible, Thomas wore a fine coat that evening. Henry wore a proud smile. Edward Whitcomb welcomed guests with confidence. They spoke of crops and profits. They spoke of politics. They spoke of maintaining order among their slaves. None of them imagined that order could crack. As darkness fell, the party began in full spirit. Fiddles played, boots stomped, wine and rum flowed freely. Enslaved servants moved to the crowd pouring drinks. Mingo watched everything carefully. He noticed which guests drank too much. He noticed which guards slipped away to join the celebration. The plantation was less secure than usual. Celebration makes people blind. Near midnight, Thomas Whitcomb was heavily intoxicated. He bragged loudly about discipline. He laughed about the whipping of an old woman months earlier. He said weakness deserved punishment. Some guests laughed with him. Others shifted uncomfortably. Henry drank less, but still carried pride in his eyes. Around that time, Mingo quietly slipped away toward the blacksmith shed. Earlier that week, he had carefully hidden something beneath loose floorboards. A blade, not long like a sword, not small like a kitchen knife. A strong, sharp iron blade shaped from a broken farming tool. Jacob had unknowingly helped create it. Mingo lifted it now. It felt balanced in his hand. Heavy enough, sharp enough. He wrapped it in cloth and secured it under his loose shirt. His heart beat steady. Not fast, not wild, steady. He walked back toward the noise of celebration. The night air was thick and humid. Crickets sang in the distance. The moon hung half full above the trees. Thomas stumbled away from the party toward the stables just as Mingo expected. Henry remained near the main house, speaking with guests. Timing mattered. Mingo followed Thomas at a distance. The drunken young master sang loudly, unaware of footsteps behind him. Inside the stable, lantern light flickered weakly. Horses shifted in their stalls. Thomas leaned against a wooden post, laughing to himself. He did not see Mingo enter. He did not hear the blade leave the cloth. When Thomas finally turned, it was too late. For a moment, their eyes met. Recognition flashed. Not fear at first. Confusion. How dare an enslaved man stand that close without permission? Then fear arrived. Thomas tried to speak, tried to shout, but Mingo moved fast. Years of field labor had made him strong. The blade struck deep and clean. The sound was brief. A gasp, a heavy fall against straw. Silence returned quickly. Mingo stood still, breathing slowly. There was no wild shouting, no trembling, only silence. The first part of his vengeance was complete, but Henry still lived, and Henry had held the whip too. Mingo wiped the blade clean on Thomas's fine coat. He stepped outside and listened. The party still roared with laughter. No one had noticed. He dragged Thomas's body deeper into the stable shadows. Then he walked calmly back toward the celebration. Henry now stood near the large oak tree, speaking confidently to a young woman from a neighboring plantation. Mingo approached carrying a tray of empty cups, pretending to work. He lowered his eyes respectfully. Henry barely noticed him. The moment was not yet right. Patience had brought him this far. Patience would carry him further. Because revenge is not only about killing. It is about making sure the message is understood. And Henry would understand before the night ended. The music grew louder. The guests grew drunker. The guards grew careless. And under the same moon that had watched Abina die in the rice field months earlier, her son moved like a shadow preparing to finish what he had begun. The music from the fiddles rose into the warm night air as laughter echoed across the yard, and no one yet knew that Thomas Whitcomb lay lifeless inside the stable, his proud voice silenced forever. Lantern light flickered against white faces flushed with rum, and servants moved quickly between tables carrying trays of roasted meat and bottles. Mingo walked among them like any other enslaved worker, his head slightly lowered, his breathing calm, his hands steady. Inside him there was no confusion, no panic, only purpose. The first storm had struck quietly, but the second still waited. Henry Whitcomb stood near the oak tree, speaking boldly about the future of the plantation. He told a guest that discipline was the backbone of success. He laughed as he described how fear kept workers obedient. His voice carried confidence, but beneath that confidence was ignorance. He did not know that his brother was already gone. He did not know that the same hands he had once forced to hold his mother back were now free and armed. Mingo watched Henry carefully. Timing was everything. A loud confrontation would bring guns. Panic would bring guards. He needed Henry separated from the crowd, just as Thomas had been separated. Opportunity arrived sooner than expected. A servant whispered something into Henry's ear. It was about the horses. Henry frowned slightly. He said he would check on them himself. He liked to show authority. He liked to demonstrate control. He excused himself from the conversation and began walking toward the stables. Mingo felt a quiet shift inside his chest. Fate had opened the door. He placed the tray down and followed at a measured pace, keeping distance but never losing sight. The yard behind them was bright and noisy, but the path toward the stable grew darker and quieter with every step. Crickets sang in the tall grass. The air smelled of hay and earth. Henry walked with irritation, not fear. He muttered about careless servants and lazy workers. He reached the stable door and pushed it open. The lantern inside still burned weakly. Horses moved restlessly in their stalls. Sensing something was wrong, Henry stepped inside. He took 2 steps forward. Then he stopped. His body froze. His breath caught in his throat. There, partly hidden in the shadows, lay Thomas. At first Henry did not understand what he was seeing. Then he saw the blood dark against straw. He rushed forward, kneeling beside his brother. He called Thomas's name. No answer came. Panic rose in his voice. He shouted for help. But before the shout could travel far, another sound filled the space behind him. The stable door creak closed. Henry turned sharply. In the dim lantern light, he saw Mingo standing near the entrance. Not bowed, not submissive, standing straight. Henry's eyes widened with disbelief. He tried to stand quickly, reaching for the small pistol tucked at his side. But grief and shock slowed him. Mingo moved faster. Years in the rice fields had built quiet strength into his limbs. He crossed the space between them in a breath. The blade flashed once in lantern light. Henry struggled, but struggle without preparation is weakness. His pistol fell into straw. His breath turned ragged. His words became broken whispers. For a moment their faces were close. Henry saw recognition in Mingo's eyes. Not wild madness. Not chaos. Clarity. Henry tried to speak a command as he always had. But commands only work when fear exists. And fear had left Mingo long ago. The stable fell silent, except for the restless shifting of horses. Outside, the party still roared, unaware that both heirs of Edward Whitcomb now lay still on the same straw floor. Mingo stepped back slowly. His breathing remained steady. He did not shout. He did not run. He stood over them and allowed the moment to settle. The sons who had whipped his mother to death were gone. Justice, in its own harsh language, had spoken. But vengeance carries consequence. The plantation would not remain blind forever. Mingo wiped the blade once more and hid it beneath loose boards near the stable wall. He knew he could not escape easily. Patrols watched the roads. Swamps were dangerous. But escape was not his first thought. His first thought was truth. He wanted Edward Whitcomb to know. He wanted the father to understand what pain felt like when it returned. Mingo stepped outside into the night air. The moon still hung above the trees. Music continued. He walked calmly back toward the yard. No one noticed a faint change in his shirt where blood had dried dark. He blended once more into shadow. Several minutes passed before a stable hand went to check on the horses. The scream that followed shattered the celebration. Music stopped mid-note. Laughter froze. Guests turned toward the sound. Edward Whitcomb rushed toward the stable with several men behind him carrying lanterns and pistols. Mingo stood among the servants, watching without expression. When Edward entered the stable and saw his sons lying lifeless, a sound escaped him that no one had heard before. It was not the voice of a master. It was the voice of a father. Shock became rage. He shouted for every slave to be gathered at once. Guards ran to secure the yard. Lanterns multiplied. Guns were loaded. Fear replaced celebration. All enslaved workers were forced into a line before the main house. Edward Whitcomb's face was pale and twisted with fury. He demanded answers. No one spoke. Silence hung thick and dangerous. He ordered random beatings. He threatened mass punishment. Still no one spoke. Mingo stood quietly among them. He felt no urge to confess immediately. He watched Edward's grief twist into cruelty. He watched guests whisper nervously. Some feared rebellion. Some feared blame. Hours passed in chaos. Search dogs were brought. Guards questioned each enslaved person. Finally, near dawn, suspicion turned toward Mingo. Someone had seen him near the stable earlier. 2 guards dragged him forward before Edward Whitcomb. Edward stared into Mingo's face with burning hatred. He demanded to know what happened. For a long moment, Mingo remained silent. Then he spoke calmly. He said the sons had reaped what they had sown. Gasps moved through the crowd. Edward struck him across the face. Mingo did not fall. He did not beg. He did not deny. He simply said that his mother's blood had not been forgotten. The yard fell silent, except for the distant sound of birds greeting morning. Edward ordered Mingo chained immediately. He shouted that he would hang before sunset. Guards bound Mingo's wrists tightly and forced him to his knees. But even as ropes tightened around his skin, something had shifted on that plantation. The illusion of untouchable power had cracked. Fear no longer flowed, only one way. As the sun rose over South Carolina that morning in 1749, the Whitcomb plantation was no longer a place of easy cruelty. It had become a place where consequence had arrived in the night. And though Mingo now faced certain death, his eyes held something no whip could remove. Calm. The sun rose slowly over the rice fields of South Carolina, casting long pale light across the plantation yard, where chaos had replaced celebration. The laughter of the night before had turned into whispers of fear and anger. Edward Whitcomb stood like a man hollowed from the inside, his eyes red, his jaw tight, his hands shaking not from weakness, but from a grief that had turned into rage. Before him, chained at the wrists and ankles, knelt Mingo. The young enslaved man did not bow his head. He did not spit defiance either. He simply looked forward, calm as still water before a storm. Around them, the other enslaved workers stood in forced lines, guarded by armed men who now saw danger in every dark face. Word had already begun to travel beyond the plantation. Riders had been sent at first light to neighboring estates and to the town nearby. 2 white sons of the powerful planter had been killed in one night. Fear spread faster than truth. Some whispered that a full rebellion had begun. Others feared that more plantations would burn before sunset. The memory of Stono still lived in white minds. Panic was close beneath the surface. Edward Whitcomb demanded that Mingo be tied to the whipping post immediately. He wanted answers, though he already knew them. The overseer hesitated for a brief second, perhaps sensing that beating a man who had already confessed would not change anything. But fear of Edward was stronger than hesitation. Mingo was dragged upright and secured against a wooden post in the center of the yard, the same post where many had cried, the same post where Bina had once stood trembling. A crowd gathered. Some white guests from the night before had not yet left. They watched in stiff silence, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or something else entirely. Edward stepped forward. He asked Mingo why. The question was not truly seeking an answer. It was seeking submission. Mingo's voice, when he spoke, carried steady and clear. He said that a mother's blood cries louder than any whip. A murmur moved through the enslaved line. Guards shifted uneasily. Edward's face twisted with fury. He ordered the lash. The whip cracked through the morning air. Once, twice, 3 times. Flesh split. Blood flowed. But Mingo did not scream. His jaw tightened, his muscles strained against rope, yet he remained silent. Each strike echoed across the yard, like a drumbeat. Some enslaved workers closed their eyes. Others forced themselves to watch. Watching meant remembering. Watching meant understanding that fear did not always win. After many lashes, Edward signaled to stop. He walked closer, breathing hard. He said that by law Mingo would hang before sunset as a warning to every slave in the county. He said the body would be left hanging for days. He said suffering would erase courage. Mingo lifted his head despite pain and said quietly that courage had already done its work. That answer unsettled more than anger would have. Edward ordered him thrown into the small storage shed near the main house until execution could be prepared. Chains clanked as guards dragged him away. Inside the dark shed, the air was thick with dust and old grain. Mingo collapsed against the wall, his back burning, his body weak. Yet his mind remained sharp. He knew death was certain. Escape was nearly impossible. Patrols now circled the roads. Swamps were watched. Guns were ready. But outside that shed, something else was happening. Among the enslaved quarters, whispers began to move like wind through tall grass. They spoke of what Mingo had done. They spoke of how he had stood without begging. They spoke of how Thomas and Henry had fallen like any other men. Fear had ruled for generations, but now a new feeling stirred. It was not reckless rebellion. It was awareness. The sons of power had been mortal. The invincible had bled. Kofi, the older enslaved man who once warned Mingo against revenge, sat outside his cabin staring at the ground. He had lived long enough to see many die. He understood the price that would come. Retaliation would be harsh. Punishments would increase. Yet even he could not deny that something had shifted. By midday, local militia arrived from nearby plantations. They brought extra weapons and ropes. Edward Whitcomb demanded a public execution before sunset. He wanted fear restored quickly. A tall oak tree near the yard was chosen. A rope was prepared. The entire enslaved population was ordered to witness. As afternoon heat pressed down heavy, guards opened the shed and pulled Mingo out once more. His back was torn. His steps were slow, but not broken. Chains clinked against the dry earth. He was forced to stand beneath the oak tree. Edward Whitcomb stood nearby. His grief hardened into cruelty. He addressed the gathered enslaved workers. He said this was what happened to those who dared defy their masters. He said order would be restored. He said fear would return. But as he spoke, he noticed something unsettling. The enslaved faces before him did not show the same terror as before. They showed sorrow. They showed anger. They showed something quiet and deep that could not be easily whipped away. The rope was placed around Mingo's neck. The noose tightened against the skin. A hush fell over the yard. In that silence, even the wind seemed to pause. Edward asked if Mingo had final words. He likely expected pleading, perhaps apology. Instead, Mingo spoke, clearly despite pain. He said that no whip can erase a mother's love. He said that blood answers blood. He said that one day chains would break not by silence, but by memory. Those words were simple, yet they carried weight heavier than iron. Some white men shifted uncomfortably. Guards tightened their grip on rifles. Edward gave the signal. The platform beneath Mingo's feet was kicked away. His body jerked once, then stilled. The oak tree stood tall and silent. The execution was meant to end fear among the enslaved. Instead, it planted something deeper. As the sun lowered toward evening in 1749, the Whitcomb plantation had lost more than 2 sons. It had lost certainty. And though Mingo's body now hung beneath the oak tree, his act could not be undone. That night, the plantation did not sleep peacefully. The guards remained alert. Edward Whitcomb stared at the darkness from his porch, haunted not only by grief but by the realization that fear is not permanent. It can crack. It can reverse. And once reversed, it never returns the same. The body of Mingo hung from the oak tree as evening settled over the Whitcomb plantation, and the air felt heavier than it ever had before. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a red glow that stretched across the rice fields like spilled blood. Guards were ordered to keep watch through the night. Edward Whitcomb stood on the porch of the main house long after darkness covered the yard. He had buried his sons before sunset, placing them in polished wooden coffins carried by white men who whispered in fear rather than pride. There had been no music now, no celebration, no loud boasting, only silence and tension. Edward believed he had restored order by hanging Mingo quickly. He believed swift punishment would crush any thought of rebellion. But deep inside, he felt something he could not name. It was not only grief. It was doubt. In the slave quarters, no one slept easily. Some wept quietly for Mingo. Others feared what would follow. Retaliation was certain. History had taught them that when one enslaved person struck back, many suffered. Kofi sat outside his cabin again, staring at the oak tree in the distance where the shadow of Mingo's body swayed slightly in the night breeze. He whispered a prayer in a language brought from across the ocean. He knew that courage can inspire, but it can also bring fire. Before midnight, the first signs of that fire appeared. The overseer, under orders from Edward, gathered several enslaved men at random and whipped them publicly, accusing them of knowing about Mingo's plan. They did not confess because they truly did not know. Mingo had told no one. His revenge had been his alone. Still, punishment fell without reason. The crack of the whip echoed once more across the plantation. But something had changed in how those sounds were heard. Before, the whip brought only fear. Now it brought memory of resistance. The guards noticed something else unsettling. The enslaved workers did not look at the ground as much. Their eyes met each other more often. Silent understanding moved between them. Not loud, not reckless, but steady. By morning, word of what happened spread beyond the Whitcomb plantation. Travelers carried news to nearby counties. 2 white sons killed by an enslaved man seeking revenge for his mother. Some planters dismissed it as isolated madness. Others increased patrols immediately. Fear spread quietly through white communities. The idea that an enslaved man could wait patiently, plan carefully, and strike with precision disturbed them deeply. They preferred to believe enslaved people were simple, broken, incapable of strategy. Mingo's actions shattered that illusion. Edward Whitcomb tried to present strength. He called neighboring planters together that week to discuss stricter controls. He demanded harsher laws. He insisted that enslaved people must never be allowed near tools without supervision. He blamed kindness, though he had shown none. He blamed outside influence. He refused to blame cruelty. But even as he spoke in meetings, his voice sometimes faltered. He saw Thomas's laughter in his memory. He saw Henry's proud walk. He saw them lying still in straw. He could not erase that image. Back on the plantation, Mingo's body remained hanging for 2 full days as a warning. Yet warnings do not always work the way they are intended. On the second night, under thick darkness, something quiet happened. A small group of enslaved men, including Kofi, moved carefully toward the oak tree after the guards drifted into careless sleep. They cut the rope silently. They lowered Mingo's body with respect. They carried him gently to the burial ground behind the quarters. No loud ceremony. No song that could alert patrols. Only whispered words in careful hands. They buried him beside his mother. They placed earth over him and smoothed it flat so no one would notice. In doing so, they reclaimed something the master had tried to deny: dignity. The next morning, when guards discovered the body gone, panic erupted again. Edward Whitcomb raged. He ordered searches. He threatened mass punishment. But no one spoke. The burial ground had many small markers. One more did not stand out. Edward increased restrictions. Curfews tightened. Tools were locked away at night. Whippings became more frequent for small offenses. Yet the plantation no longer felt the same. Fear had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled alone. It now shared space with quiet defiance. Stories began to grow. Among enslaved communities in neighboring areas, Mingo's name spread softly. Some exaggerated details. Some added bravery beyond truth. But the core remained real. A son had avenged his mother. He had not begged. He had not trembled. He had spoken clearly before death. In a world where enslaved voices were crushed daily, that mattered. Months passed. The rice harvest came and went. Edward Whitcomb aged visibly within a single season. Grief hollowed his face. He became harsher, yet also more withdrawn. He trusted no one fully anymore. He slept with a pistol beneath his pillow. Every sound at night startled him. He often dreamed of footsteps in the stable. He began seeing threat where there was none. That is the strange power of vengeance. It does not end when the blade falls. It lingers in the mind of those who once believed themselves untouchable. Meanwhile, Kofi and others kept Mingo's memory alive through quiet storytelling. They told younger children what had happened, not to encourage reckless action, not to promise easy victory, but to teach that dignity can survive even when the body does not. They taught that cruelty carries consequence, even if that consequence demands sacrifice. As seasons shifted, the Whitcomb plantation slowly regained routine on the surface. Work continued. Crops grew. Orders were shouted. But beneath that surface, something permanent had changed. The illusion that masters were beyond reach had cracked forever. Mingo had paid with his life, but he had also carved a mark into history that no whip could erase. And though the world outside continued as if nothing extraordinary had occurred in 1749, those who lived on that plantation knew differently. They had seen justice arrive in the night. They had seen fear change direction, and they would never forget. Years passed after the events of 1749, but the shadow of that summer never fully left the Whitcomb plantation or the lands around it. Time moved forward as it always does. Rice continued to grow in the flooded fields. New enslaved people were brought in chains from Charleston markets to replace those who had died or been sold. Seasons shifted from heat to storm to brief cool winds and back again. On the surface, life appeared unchanged. But beneath the surface, memory worked quietly like roots beneath soil. Edward Whitcomb never recovered from the deaths of his sons. Grief hardened him in ways that even cruelty had not before. He trusted no one. He doubled patrols. He installed stricter rules. He ordered random night searches of cabins. He banned gatherings after dark unless supervised. Yet even as he tightened control, he sensed something slipping beyond his reach. Fear was no longer pure. It was mixed with resentment that had tasted proof. Enslaved people spoke carefully, but their silence carried weight. The story of Mingo had spread far beyond the Whitcomb land. Travelers carried whispers into other counties. Some told it in hushed voices near river docks. Some shared it in fields while pretending to speak about weather. The story changed slightly in each telling, but one truth remained constant. A man had avenged his mother. He had waited. He had struck. He had stood without begging. That truth traveled faster than horses. By the early years of the new decade, planters across South Carolina were more uneasy than they admitted publicly. Laws tightened across the colony. Patrol systems strengthened. Restrictions increased on movement and tools. Publicly, they claimed it was precaution. Privately, they feared imitation. Because if one enslaved man could act alone with such precision, what might happen if many acted together? Kofi grew older with each passing year. His hair turned more gray. His back bent further from labor. Yet his voice remained steady when he spoke of Mingo to younger generations. He did not glorify blood. He did not encourage reckless death. He spoke of patience. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of remembering names erased by force. He often told the children that power built on cruelty carries cracks inside it. Sometimes those cracks stay hidden. Sometimes they split open suddenly. The burial ground behind the quarters gained more unmarked mounds over time. Disease, punishment, exhaustion, childbirth. Life under bondage was always fragile. But the mound beside Abina, the one where Mingo now rested, held a different kind of meaning. Some nights, younger enslaved men would sit nearby and speak softly of escape. They spoke of swamps where maroons lived beyond reach. They spoke of ships in Charleston Harbor. They spoke of distant northern lands. Not all plans were realistic. Many were only dreams. But dreams matter. They shape the direction of courage. Edward Whitcomb aged into a solitary man. He never remarried. He never rebuilt the joy he once displayed through his sons. Visitors noticed the difference. They saw how quickly he reached for his pistol when startled. They saw how his eyes scanned every enslaved face as if searching for another Mingo. Grief can become a prison as strong as chains. The plantation continued to profit, but its spirit was altered. The sons who would have inherited control were gone. Distant relatives showed interest in the estate, but none carried the same arrogance as Thomas and Henry. Their deaths had sent a message not only to the enslaved, but also to the white community. Brutality has consequence. By the time the calendar reached the middle of the century, the memory of 1749 still lingered among local families. White children were warned to be cautious around slaves. They were told stories not only of rebellion, but of revenge. Some details were twisted to paint Mingo as a monster. Yet even in those twisted versions, fear remained clear. He had acted alone. He had waited. He had struck without warning. Among enslaved communities, his story became quieter over time but never vanished. It was told during long nights after exhausting labor. It was told to remind that pain does not erase humanity. It was told to show that even in chains, choice still exists, though choice often costs dearly. The decades that followed brought greater storms to America. Tensions over slavery grew louder. Laws hardened in some places and softened in others. By the time the nation moved toward open conflict in the 1860s, the foundations of slavery were shaking. Many who fought later would not know Mingo's name. His story was not written in official records with honor. It was buried in plantation reports and whispered memory. But the spirit behind his action lived within the larger resistance that would eventually shake the entire system. Edward Whitcomb did not live to see the Civil War. He died years before it began, alone in the same house where he once celebrated his sons. Some say he never stopped hearing the echo of stable doors closing at night. Some say he never again trusted silence. His estate passed to distant relatives who managed it through the war years. When emancipation finally came in the 1860s, formerly enslaved families left that land with mixed emotions. Freedom arrived with uncertainty, poverty, and danger, yet it was freedom still. Among those who left were descendants of people who had once stood in the yard and watched Mingo hang. As they stepped beyond plantation boundaries the first time without chains, some remembered his final words. Blood answers blood. Memory breaks chains. They understood that his revenge had not ended slavery, but had pierced the myth that cruelty faced no consequence. In the years after emancipation, stories of resistance slowly entered public conversation. Some became famous. Many did not. Mingo's name rarely appeared in written history. Records kept by masters focus on property loss, not motive. But history does not live only in books. It lives in oral tradition. It lives in whispered stories passed from one generation to the next. Today, when we look back at places like South Carolina in the colonial era, we often hear about laws, plantations, economics, and rebellion. We hear about organized uprisings and famous leaders. But individual acts of revenge, personal acts of justice carried out quietly in the dark, often remain hidden. Yet they shaped the emotional landscape of slavery just as powerfully. Mingo's story forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when a system built on violence meets someone who refuses to forget? What happens when fear changes direction? What happens when a son decides that his mother's life cannot be erased without answer? These questions do not fade with time. They echo forward. By the end of his life, Kofi would tell children one final lesson about Mingo. He would say that vengeance is heavy and costly, but dignity is priceless. He would say that Mingo did not act because he loved blood. He acted because he loved his mother. And love, when crushed, can become the strongest force of all. The oak tree where Mingo was hanged did not survive into the next century. Storms eventually split it. Time decayed it. But long after the wood rotted into soil, the memory remained rooted deeper than any tree. And history, though slow, never fully forgets those who dare to answer cruelty with courage. Long after the oak tree had fallen, and the Whitcomb name had faded from local power, the story of Mingo remained like an ember buried under ash, quiet yet never fully cold. Generations came and went across the Carolina soil. The rice fields that once demanded bent backs slowly changed ownership. War reshaped the land. Freedom arrived in law, though justice arrived much slower. Yet even as decades passed, there were elders who remembered hearing the whispers from their own elders about a man who chose not to let his mother's blood disappear into silence. The official records of 1749 remain cold and brief. They listed the deaths of 2 planter sons. They recorded the execution of an enslaved man. They did not record the reason with sympathy. They did not describe the whip tearing flesh from an exhausted woman in a flooded field. They did not explain how humiliation can build quietly until it becomes resolve. History written by power rarely honors those who resist that power. But history, carried in memory, tells a fuller truth. In communities formed after emancipation, older men and women sometimes sat beneath trees in the evening and spoke of the old days. They spoke of cruelty that once ruled every sunrise. They spoke of loss and hunger and broken families. And sometimes when trust allowed, they spoke of Mingo. They described how he moved quietly, how he did not boast, how he waited, how he struck only those who had taken his mother's life. They described how he stood before death without lowering his eyes. They did not celebrate killing. They did not paint revenge as easy or glorious. They spoke of it as costly. They spoke of it as the final voice of a son who had nothing left to lose. Over time, the land where the Whitcomb plantation once stood changed hands many times. Buildings were repaired, then rebuilt, then replaced entirely. New crops were planted. New families settled. Travelers passing through would see only fields and trees, unaware of the blood once spilled there. But memory does not depend on visible markers. It survives in story. And story survives in those who listen. In the late 1800s, when formerly enslaved families began seeking education and recording their own histories, fragments of older stories resurfaced. Not every name was clear, not every date precise, but there were mentions of a man in the colonial years who avenged his mother. Local oral tradition kept him alive even when books did not. His name shifted in pronunciation from mouth to mouth, but the heart of his story remained steady. A son refused to forget. As the 20th century approached and historians slowly began studying resistance within slavery more deeply, attention often focused on large revolts and famous leaders. Organized rebellions were easier to document. Court records preserved their details. But individual vengeance, especially when swift and personal, often hid between lines of plantation logs. Yet scholars who listened carefully to oral accounts noticed patterns. They saw that resistance was not only organized uprisings, it was also quiet acts, small refusals, personal reckonings. Mingo's act fit within that larger truth. His revenge did not overthrow a system. It did not spark a colony-wide rebellion, but it cracked the illusion that masters were untouchable, and illusions, once cracked, rarely return whole. Imagine the weight inside that young man in 1749. Imagine the image of his mother falling in the mud beneath blows meant to break her spirit. Imagine carrying that image while continuing to labor daily under the same sun that witnessed her death. Imagine choosing not to scream immediately, not to rush blindly, but to wait, to study, to calculate. That patience tells us something powerful about the human spirit under oppression. It tells us that even in chains, thought remains free. It tells us that memory can become a form of resistance. The educational lesson within this story is not about violence alone. It is about consequence. Systems built on cruelty create conditions where retaliation becomes inevitable. When human dignity is denied repeatedly, eventually someone will demand it back, even at the cost of their own life. Mingo understood the price. His calm before execution shows that he had already accepted it. He knew that killing Thomas and Henry would not end slavery. He knew he would not live to see freedom. But he also knew that silence would mean accepting that his mother's life meant nothing, and that he could not accept. Today, when we reflect on forgotten figures like Mingo, we are reminded that history is not only shaped by those who hold official titles or command armies. It is also shaped by individuals who make deeply personal choices in moments of unbearable pain. His act forces modern viewers to confront uncomfortable realities about the brutality of slavery in colonial South Carolina. It forces us to remember that behind every plantation statistic were human beings with families, with love, with memories that could not be whipped away. It sparks curiosity about how many other names were erased, how many other acts of quiet revenge never reached written record, how many stories remain buried beneath soil and silence. For you watching today, perhaps from a city thousands of miles away from Carolina fields, consider what this story teaches about power and resistance. Consider how systems of injustice often appear stable until one unexpected act exposes their fragility. Consider how love for family can drive courage beyond fear. Mingo's life was short. His death was brutal. But his choice echoed beyond the oak tree where he hanged. It echoed into whispers that traveled plantation to plantation. It echoed into stories that crossed generations. It echoed into broader truth that oppression is never fully secure. As the sun sets each day over lands once scarred by slavery, we are reminded that those who suffered there were not faceless. They were sons and daughters, mothers and fathers. Some endured quietly. Some resisted openly. Some, like Mingo, chose a path of vengeance that forced even the powerful to feel fear. And fear, once tasted by the oppressor, changes the balance forever. His story stands as both warning and testament. Warning that cruelty breeds consequence. Testament that dignity can survive even when the body does not. We may never know every detail of his early life. We may never uncover the exact words his mother tried to whisper before her final breath, but we know enough. We know that a son refused to let injustice pass unanswered. We know that in 1749, beneath a Carolina moon, the sons of a cruel master fell because they believed themselves beyond consequence. And we know that their father, who once ruled through terror, spent his remaining years haunted by the proof that terror can return home. History often forgets names like Mingo because they do not fit neatly into official narratives. But here on Voices from Forgotten Souls, we bring those names back into light. We remind the world that forgotten does not mean insignificant. We honor the complexity, the pain, and the courage found in stories hidden between pages. If the story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think differently about the past, then let it continue to live through you. Share it, discuss it, reflect on it, because memory is a powerful form of justice. Thank you for watching Voices from Forgotten Souls. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, and your country. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Join our membership platform to help us continue uncovering stories like this. Remember, our PayPal link is in the description if you wish to support our research work. We appreciate your love and support deeply. We do not take it for granted. Until our next story, keep listening for the voices history tried to silence.